Hello students, welcome to our afternoon read aloud. Today we are going to continue our learning about George Washington Carver with this biography called A Weed is a Flower, The Life of George Washington Carver, written and illustrated by Aliki. Aliki is a famous children's book illustrator. And there's George Washington Carver taking care of a little green plant. Oh, and on the back, the plant that he's most famous for, the peanut plant. There you can see the peanuts growing underground with their roots, and that's the plant above the ground with the flowers and the leaves. Here we go. A weed is a flower. The life of George Washington Carver. And there's a dandelion, right? Okay, oh, this must be about when he was born, as he was a baby. When George Washington Carver was born, he had many things against him. He was a sick, weak little baby. His father had just died, and his mother was left alone to care for him and for his brother James. And even worse, he was the son of slaves. There was no hope for the future. But George Washington Carver was no ordinary man. He was a man who turned evil into good, despair into hope. Despair is extreme sadness. And hatred into love. He was a man who devoted his whole life to helping his people and the world around him. This is his story. George Washington Carver was born in Missouri in 1860, more than 100 years ago. It was a terrible time. Mean men rode silently in the night, kidnapping slaves from their owners and harming those who tried to stop them. One night, a band of these men rode up to the farm of Moses Carver, who owned George and his mother Mary. Everyone ran in fear, but before Mary could hide her baby, the men came and snatched them both and rode away into the night. Moses Carver sent a man to look for them. Mary was never found, but in a few days, the man returned with a small bundle wrapped in his coat and tied to the back of his saddle. It was the baby George. Moses and his wife Susan cared for Mary's children. George remained small and weak, but as he grew, they saw he was an unusual child. He wanted to know about everything around him. He asked about the rain, the flowers, and the insects. He asked questions the Carvers couldn't answer. And remember, I said that's something that he was very lucky about, that the people who owned them, he was still a slave, but they were pretty kind, and they cared for him, and they helped him to learn. When he was very young, George kept a garden where he spent hours each day caring for his plants. If they weren't growing well, he found out why. Soon they were healthy and blooming. In winter, he covered his plants to protect them. In spring, he planted new seeds. George looked after each plant as though it was the only one in his garden. Neighbors began to ask George's advice about their plants, and soon he was known as the plant doctor. As time went on, George wondered about more and more things. He wanted to learn and yearned to go to school. In the meantime, the slaves had been freed, but schools nearby were not open to Negroes. So that's the old-fashioned word to refer to black people. So when he was 10, George left his brother, his garden, and the Carver farm and went off to find the answers to his questions. Wherever George Washington Carver found schools, he stayed. He worked for people to earn his keep. Your keep is like your kind of your room and board, right? So he worked just for whatever he could to be able to stay nearby schools. He scrubbed their floors, washed their clothes, and baked their bread. Whatever George did, he did well. Even the smallest chore was important to him. Some people took George in as their son. First, he stayed with Mariah and Andy Watkins, who were like parents to him. Then he moved to Kansas and lived with Aunt Lucy and Uncle Seymour. They, too, loved this quiet boy who was so willing to help. So he was willing to go anywhere and work if it was near a school where he could go and keep learning. George worked hard for many years, always trying to save enough money for college. Other boys who had parents to help them were able to enter college much sooner than George. He was 30 before he had saved enough. Still, it was not that simple. All colleges would not admit Negroes even if they had the money to pay. George was not discouraged. He moved to Iowa and found a college that was glad to have a Negro student. At college, George continued to work. He opened a laundry where he washed his schoolmates' clothes. And he continued to learn. His teachers and friends soon realized that this earnest young man was bursting with talents. He played the piano, he sang beautifully, and he was an outstanding painter. In fact, for a time he thought about becoming an artist. And I'm remembering the picture of the farm that was at the beginning of the other biography we read, right? His painting. But the more George thought of what he wanted to do, the more he wanted to help his people, and he remembered that his neighbors used to call him the plant doctor. He had never forgotten his love for plants. In all the years he had wandered, he always had something growing in his room. So George Washington Carver chose to study agriculture. He learned about plants, flowers, and soil. He learned the names of the weeds. Even they were important to him. He often said, "A weed is a flower growing in the wrong place." He still asked questions. If no person or book could answer them, he found the answers himself. He experimented with his own plants and found out secrets that nobody knew. When George finished college, he began to teach. He was asked to go to Alabama, where a college for Negroes needed his talent. It was there, at Tuskegee Institute, that George Washington Carver made his life. In Alabama, Professor Carver taught his students and the poor Negro farmers who earned their livelihood from the soil. He taught them how to make their crops grow better. Most of the farmers raised cotton, but sometimes the crops were destroyed. Most of the farmers raised cotton, but sometimes the crops were destroyed by rain or insects, and the farmers couldn't earn enough to eat. Professor Carver told them to plant other things as well. Sweet potatoes and peanuts were good crops. They were easy to grow. He said that raising only cotton harmed the soil. It was better if different crops were planted each year. The farmers did not want to listen. They were afraid to plant peanuts and sweet potatoes. They were sure that no one would buy them. But Professor Carver had experimented in his laboratory. He had found many things could be made from the sweet potato. He made soap, coffee, and starch. He made more than 100 things from the sweet potato. And even though people in those days called peanuts monkey food, Professor Carver said they were good for people too. So can you imagine back then people didn't usually eat peanuts yet? But besides, he found that still more things could be made from the peanut. Paper, ink, shaving cream, sauces, linoleum, shampoo, even milk. In fact, he made 300 different products from the peanut. Once, when important guests were expected at Tuskegee, Dr. Carver chose the menu. The guests sat around the table and enjoyed a meal of soup, creamed mock chicken, bread, salad, coffee, candy, cake, and ice cream. Imagine their surprise when they learned that the meal was entirely made from peanuts. So the peanuts were made into different forms. So they tasted kind of like different things, right? Slowly, the farmers listened to George Washington Carver. They planted peanuts and sweet potatoes, and before they knew it, these became two of the most important crops in Alabama. They're pulling a peanut plant there. Soon the whole country knew about Dr. Carver and the great things he was doing. He was honored by presidents and other important people. Every day his mailbox bulged with letters from farmers and scientists who wanted his advice. He was offered great sums of money, which he turned down. Money was not important to him. He did not even bother to cash many of the checks he received. Throughout his life, George Washington Carver asked nothing of others. He sought only to help. He lived alone and tended to his own needs. He washed his clothes and patched them too. He used the soap he made and ate the food he grew. So even when he was so famous and he could have earned a lot of money, he wasn't interested in money. He just wanted to keep helping people. And he still, even though he was famous, he took care of himself, right? He washed his own clothes. He made his food. He didn't have people doing things for him, even though he could have, right? Dr. Carver was asked to speak in many parts of the world, but he did not leave Tuskegee often. He had things to do. He continued to paint. He worked in his greenhouse and his laboratory, where he discovered many things. He discovered that dyes could be made from plants and colors from the Alabama clay. Even when he was over 80 and close to death, Dr. Carver kept working night after night while the rest of the town lay asleep. A light still shone in his window. So there he is, staying up late, always working. A busy bee. The baby born with no hope for the future grew into one of the great scientists of his country. George Washington Carver, with his goodness and devotion, helped not only his own people, but all peoples of the world. There we go. So, how about that? So I got to do something at the end of the book, and what I want to do is actually show you this picture. So a peanut, some plants, we eat the things that grow underground. Some plants we eat the leaves. Some plants we eat the stems. It all depends, right? So in the case of a peanut, we eat the peanuts which grow down under the ground. And they pull the plant out and then they harvest the peanuts. So I hope you enjoyed our afternoon read aloud. Don't forget to keep washing your hands, cover your coughs and sneezes, do some reading, do some writing, help your family around the house, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.